Hey guys, so today we are going to be reviewing commas and different sentence types, just as a refresher since we have already learned this before. The first one we are going to be talking about is a dependent clause. And a dependent clause is a sentence that cannot stand on its own and it's dependent upon something else. So it needs something else in order to be considered a complete sentence or an independent clause. So, for example, it says, while waiting on the great pumpkin, and then the sentence kind of stops there. So I know that that's not a complete sentence or a complete thought. So I know it has to depend on another part of a sentence in order to make that a complete thought. Okay. Another example would be because he brings presents to good children. So there's no subject. I know that someone's bringing presents, but there's no subject. So if I went up to someone and told someone that, it wouldn't make sense. So again, it's depending on other part of the sentence. That way, it makes a complete sentence. So a dependent clause is just a sentence that is not complete. It cannot stand on its own. On the other hand, you have an independent clause, and an independent clause may stand alone. So it is a complete thought. So, for example, it says, Snoopy thinks he is a World War II flying ace. So we have our subject, Snoopy, and then he thinks he's World War II flying base. Ace, sorry. So we have simple sentences, and a simple sentence just contains a subject and a verb. It expresses a single complete thought, and it is a single independent clause. So just think whenever you see independent clause, I know it's like a big word and it kind of sounds confusing, but just remember that it is really just a simple sentence with a subject and a verb. And an example of a simple sentence would be the gang is going trick or treating. So I have the subject, the gang, and then what are they doing? They're going trick or treating, subject and a verb. And I could even just say there are two witches, and I have the subject, right? The two witches. And since I'm talking about trick or treating, that's what the verb is. So now we have compound sentences. A compound sentence contains two independent clauses or complete thoughts, and it does contain a conjunction. And remember that we previously learned that fanboys are what makes up the what a conjunction is. Sorry. So we have for and nor, but or and yet so, which is the fanboys. And just remember, whenever you're combining and creating sentences, that the fanboy you use can change the meaning of the sentence. You need to make sure whenever you're selecting a fanboy when you're combining sentences that you use the proper one. Okay, so it makes sense in the sentence. And remember, whenever you're using a fanboy, you always have to have a comma before the fanboy. And then here are some examples of compound sentences. So the first example says, Linus waits on the great pumpkin every year, but he never shows up. So again, we're combining two thoughts here with a fanboy, which is but. And remember, there's our comma before the fanboy. The second example says, the other kids dress up, comma, yet our fanboy, Linus waits in the pumpkin patch. Again, we have our complete thoughts and we are combining them using one fanboy. Now we have our complex sentences. And a complex sentence is an independent clause joined by one or more dependent clauses. So a subordinated conjunction begins a dependent clause, and then it's followed by a comma. And a dependent clause has a subject and a verb, but it does not make sense on its own. So we'll look at some examples here. The first example says, even though his friends got candy, Charlie got a rock. So again, if I just say Charlie got a rock, that cannot stand by itself. So I have to add another part of the sentence to make it a complete thought. So that's how the first part where I added, even though his friends got candy, now I can add Charlie got a rock to make that a complex sentence. And together, it makes sense, right? They both have, it's a complete thought. The second example says Charlie was sad because he wanted a Snickers bar. So we have our subject and the verb there. Compound complex sentences. So a compound complex sentence is a sentence that has at least two independent clauses or complete thoughts and at least one dependent clause. At least one. The same subordinated junctions are used to introduce the dependent clauses, and then you are still using fanboys when joining independent and complete thoughts. So an example of a compound complex sentence would say, after Linus convinced Sally that the great pumpkin really existed, they waited in the pumpkin patch and she missed trick-or-treating. So remember, in a compound complex sentence, it could at least have one or more dependent clauses. So for example, this one would be an example of that. So we have our subjects, we have the verb, they're waiting, and we know that we have to have the independent clause, and the dependent clause has to go with it because it can't stand on its own. Here's another example. It says, even though Charlie is a nice guy, his friends gave him a hard time, and his dog is no different. Again, we have Charlie, his friends are giving him a hard time, so we're combining the independent and dependent clause here to form the compound complex sentence. So now for the next slides, we are going to look at each sentence and kind of figure out what type of sentence it is, okay? And then we'll kind of see why. So for the first type of sentence, it says, the party was fun. So I have to figure out of the types of sentences we just talked about, what kind of sentence it is. So for the first one, this is a simple sentence. And I know it's a simple sentence because it has the subject and it has the verb, right? We know the party. What about the party was fun? And it is just one complete thought. So that is just a simple sentence. For this next example, it says, Lucy bobbed for apples, but she got Snoopy instead. So I remembered when we were looking at the PowerPoint, a compound sentence it was a sentence that had two complete thoughts that was connected using a fanboy or coordinating conjunction. So Lucy bobbed for apples, that can stand by itself, but then I'm adding she got Snoopy instead, and I'm connecting those two thoughts using a fanboy. So that is a compound sentence. This next one, it says, what sentence type? After promising she wouldn't, Lucy still tricked Charlie Brown. So this is an example of a complex sentence. And I know that because it starts with a fanboy, and it does have two independent clauses in it. This next one says, after waiting with Linus, Sally got nothing, and she left with the other kids. So again, I know that it is starting with a fanboy, a coordinating conjunction, and it does start with a dependent clause, and then we're combining two dependent clauses to create the independent clause. So this sentence is a compound complex sentence. For this last one, it is just combining sentences. And when you're combining sentences, all you're doing is making one smoother, more detailed sentence out of two or more shorter sentences. So instead of writing an essay or anything that you're writing, and there are a lot of several choppy sentences, we're just combining sentences. So it sounds a lot better. So for example, instead of saying Sarah is tall, Sarah is pretty, you would just combine them and say Sarah is tall and pretty. So whenever you're writing an essay, just if you notice that you have a lot of those short, choppy sentences, it is better just to combine all your sentences. That way it just flows better in your paper or with whatever you're writing. Okay. And this is the example of different ways to use your comma and different sentence types. So if you need to review, you can always come back to this PowerPoint for instructions. See you later.